Hello, I'm Hale Sfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Professor Pardis Mahdavi from Pomona College and former fellow at the Wilson Center. She is the author of Gridlock, Labor, Migration, and Human Trafficking in Dubai. She wrote the book during her stay at the center in 2009 and 2010. She's among the foremost specialists on human trafficking, and while she was at the center, she helped us put together a conference which was very successful, and we had a publication as a result of that conference. The book draws on 4 years of Pardis's ethnographic research in the UAE to look at the disconnections between policies on human trafficking and the realities of gendered labor and migration in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. The book seeks to describe the experiences of migrant women and men in the Middle East and how their narratives have been constructed and misheard by policymakers and activists seeking to legislate on and label their experience and possible steps that should be taken to improve policy, discourse, and activism. Pardis's research interests include gendered labor, migration, sexuality, human rights, youth culture, transnational feminism, and public health in the context of changing global and political structure. Her first book, Passionate Uprisings, Iran's Sexual Revolution, published with Stanford University Press in 2008, just like this one, was on the intersection between sexuality and politics in post-revolutionary Iran. She currently teaches a course on medical anthropology, sociocultural anthropology, ethnographic methods, and has designed a new course entitled Sexual Politics of the Middle East. I think I will stop now and ask Pardis to speak, and she has promised to speak slowly because usually whenever she does a presentation at the center, I have to constantly remind her that slow down so we can follow you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Halejun. It's wonderful to be back here at the center. I've missed it so much. I flew into DC yesterday, and on my way here, I was feeling very nostalgic. So it's wonderful to be back, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be back. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the research I did for the book and give you kind of some snippets of what you'll find in the book. But like a good anthropologist, like a good ethnographer, I actually want to start my talk today with two stories of two individuals that I met during the course of my research. The first is the story of a young man named Ravi. And when I met Ravi, he was limping, and he didn't speak much English, but the one word that he did know, and he said over and over again, was abscond. And I sort of was probing him, what do you mean abscond? Well, it turned out that Ravi had, unfortunately his story is not too unique. He had left Hyderabad, India, when he was 19 years old. His parents had decided that they couldn't make ends meet, and so that they would have to send him to the Gulf to work in construction. And his parents met a labor broker, and the broker said, if you send your son to Dubai, he can work in construction company. It was an Indian-owned company. And he said, he'll make $600 US a month. It'll be great. You can pay back your debt, etc. The catch is you'll have to pay the equivalent of US $2,000 to get to Dubai. And so his family, but they were promised he would make it back within 2 or 3 months, no problem. So his family cobbled together the money. They borrowed from friends, family, etc., and they sent him to Dubai. When he arrived in Dubai, he was made to work long hours, and after just a couple of months, he called home, and his family said, we haven't been receiving the money. So it turned out that he'd been working 14-hour days and not getting paid. He went to his boss, who was also Indian, and he said, I haven't been getting paid. Why are you doing this? Why am I undergoing this difficult situation? And it bears highlighting here that his boss, the person who was kind of inflicting a lot of the abuses and was withholding his wages, was also Indian. And so there's this pervasive idea when it comes to the UAE that somehow the Emiratis are inflicting the abuse. And I have to say that within almost 100% of the people I interviewed, by the time they got to their Emirati kafil, their sponsor, their problem was solved, actually. And the issue was really the middlemen, and they could never quite get to their sponsor. But Ravi kept going back day after day to his boss and saying, why am I not paid my fair wages? And one day, while he was working on the site, his boss walked past and pushed him off the 5th floor story that he was working on. He fell from the 5th floor and he broke his leg. When I met him, he was in a makeshift clinic. He didn't have enough money to go home. He was in what we call debt bondage because he owed $2,000 to the labor broker. He didn't have money to go home. He was ashamed to go home. And he didn't have enough money even to fix his broken leg. He couldn't go to work. He had absconded from his job, but he was stuck. That's the first story. The second is of a young woman named Meskeram. Meskeram left Ethiopia when her father died, leaving their family in a lot of debt. Her mother had heard that there was a lot of work as domestic workers in the Middle East, and they decided that she would have to go. So she went to her Ministry of Labor in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and said that she wanted to get a contract to go and work as a domestic worker in the Emirates. Following the United States Trafficking in Persons report, Ethiopia, like the Philippines, had adopted a policy that restricted women who were not married from leaving the country. So they actually told her, because you're not married, you can't leave. She still had to leave, unfortunately, to make ends meet, and so she met a smuggler who would smuggle her across on a boat. And he said that, if she paid him $1,000, he could get her a visa, place her in the home of a family, etc. She somehow cobbled together the money. She was smuggled over into Dubai, and she was placed in the home of a British family working as a domestic worker. They wouldn't feed her. They made her sleep on the floor. When she agitated to get her wages and agitated for better working conditions, they told her that she was an illegal immigrant and that she couldn't go to the police and that she would have no rights. And she believed them because they told her that if you go to the police, you'll get arrested, you'll get deported. And so she sort of stuck it out. She stuck it out until she was getting physically abused by her employers. And when I met her, she was living on the streets, having run away from her employers, but too afraid to go to the police because her employers had told her that she would get in big trouble. Now, neither of these two stories, neither of these two individuals are imagined as trafficked in popular paradigms about trafficking, which focus, unfortunately, on the sex industry. These two stories are also important in that they show that the problem really stems from root causes of inequality and from the sending countries. So much of the work that I do in the book looks at the disconnect between policies on human trafficking and the realities of lived experience. And we see that the two are really misaligned in a lot of ways. And how they're misaligned has everything to do with race, class, and gender. And that's what I'm really going to talk about today. There's this idea that trafficking is outside of forced labor and migration, when in fact forced labor and migration are at the heart of trafficking, right? And there's an idea that persons who are in the trafficking industry are parts of rings of organized crime, et cetera, but we see in the stories I told you that it's not really about these rings of organized crime or ostensible terrorists, but it's about structural issues. And to use a concept that's put forward by Paul Farmer, it's about structural violence, the violence that they get, the cycles of violence that they go into. unfortunately, the micro focus within the trafficking policies and literature obscures the macro issues. So kind of blaming the individual or blaming groups of individuals for what they perceive as the sort of social ills of trafficking obscures the fact that oftentimes macro issues such as policies, for instance, in Ethiopia or the Philippines that restrict out migration actually force more women to go through illegal routes. Okay, so more women are smuggled because of these policies in the home countries, in the sending countries. So much of this sort of this question of the war on trafficking intersects with the war on terror in a lot of unfortunate ways. These are arguably the two biggest wars of the last decade. And the war on terror and the war on trafficking, the two collide and sort of conspire to produce this image of the Muslim Middle East as a place of danger, depravity, disease, detention, right? So there's this idea that over there are all these terrorists and traffickers, and they're working together. And most recently, you see a huge surge in articles that talk about how terrorists use trafficking to fund terror. And it's always, the trope is cast of victims, these poor women, and the villains, who are typically dark-skinned men with Middle Eastern accents. And really, you see these wars on terror and trafficking coming together to fuel the sort of clash of civilizations rhetoric, which is heightened kind of in my case study. And so the argument that I put forth is that context matters, and blaming of religion and culture, it doesn't really get us anywhere, because the blaming of the host country obscures the fact that it's actually much larger than that, right? It starts much earlier on. But the discourse on trafficking, especially as it pertains to the Middle East and ways in which the Middle East has been castigated, tries to kind of divide the region into what Mahmoud Mamdani has called good Muslims versus bad Muslims. And that's unfortunately not serving in anybody's interest. So what policies am I talking about more specifically? The first is the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, H.R. 244, Congressional Order 244, which was signed into effect by Clinton, but it was revised and reauthorized under Bush, the TVPRA. Out of that comes what we call this TIP report. It's the Trafficking in Persons Report, which was mandated by the TVPA. And the TVPA mandated the creation of an office to combat trafficking, which operates out of the State Department. And coincidentally, this past year was the 10th anniversary of 9/11, or the War on Terror, and it was also the 10th anniversary of the TIP report, which came out in 2001. So again, war on terror, war on trafficking. And I'll talk a little bit more about the collision of the two in a moment. We also have the United Nations Protocol to Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And I call your attention to the last piece of that phrase, especially women and children. Someone like Ravi, whose story I told you earlier, would fall outside of that paradigm. And the repetition of this phrase, women and children, can become very infantilizing, and it enters the lexicon as women as children. It's very infantilizing, very condescending. And it kind of rips women of their agency. It takes away agency, it takes away control, and pigeonholing women as victims. And women often have to adhere to a certain script to be considered victims. And then other policies that I look at are unilateral policies, such as the Philippine Household Workers Reform Package of 2006, which is similar to the Ethiopian policy I mentioned earlier, which says that unmarried women or women under the age of 30 either can't migrate or have to migrate after 2 years or 1 year of training, which resulted in many more women being smuggled. So what is the official definition of trafficking? Well, I'm not going to read that long Palermo Protocol definition. You can read it yourselves. But it basically comes down to three things, and this is what all the reports cover: force, fraud, or coercion. And in the two stories I began with today, you see the impact. Force is there. Fraud is there. Coercion is absolutely there. Yet, those two individuals are not imagined as trafficked, and the reason is the next definition, as outlined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's known as an act to combat trafficking in persons, especially into the sex trade, okay? There's a distinction made in the TVPA between trafficking on the one hand and severe forms of trafficking. Severe forms of trafficking are defined as instances where the sex trade is involved or persons are under the age of 18. Only persons who fall under the severe forms of trafficking are eligible for a T visa, okay, which means that only they are eligible for protection. What that functions to do is, of course, it eclipses the experiences of everybody outside of this narrow framework. It basically narrows the number of T visas that have been given. I'll give you a concrete example. In the past 2011 TIP report, Hillary Clinton is cited as saying there are millions of trafficked persons in the United States today. Since the passage of the TVPA, a decade has elapsed, correct? Now, of the millions of trafficked persons who are in the United States today, cumulatively, in the past 10 years, do you know how many T visas have been actually given out? Less than 30,000. So there's this huge disconnect. If there are 3 million trafficked persons, why are only 30,000 T visas given out? So you see what I'm getting at. Furthermore, the definition of trafficking, this is a metaphor that I often give my students. It's sort of like a rubber band. It stretches wide enough to encompass everyone in the sex industry, whether or not they were forced, frauded, or coerced. And I should add that in the UAE, I met a number of women in the sex industry who were not trafficked, who were there as a strategy, right? But then it shrinks, the rubber band shrinks to exclude everyone who is outside of that framework. So, unfortunately, the trafficking debate and the policies that have come from that are hyper-scrutinizing sex work. So you have people, the debate comes down to the prohibitionists who say, we've got to end trafficking, we have to end sex work. Now, this is problematic because it manifests itself in policies like the TIP, which recommend for the UAE increase your prosecution of sex traffickers. It's kind of an impossible recommendation. I mean, how are they supposed to do that? How are they supposed to find these boogeymen? Many of the women that I met hadn't come over via any traffickers, didn't have pimps, didn't have any of that. So it's kind of a difficult situation when sex work becomes the focus of the trafficking discourse. The policies that then follow from that put countries like the UAE in a very difficult situation. So trafficking gender. Women in sex work are conceived of as trafficked, whether or not they were. Men or women in other industries are considered migrant workers. Now, what does that do to our ideas about agency? It really restricts them. It really makes it very challenging for us to think about how do we give agency to people who are already suffering, right? And so what it does is it puts everything into a criminalization framework, right? So the United Nations Palermo Protocol that I mentioned earlier, that operates and is housed in the United Nations Office on Drug Control and Crime, okay? That's a curious place for a human rights document, right? So what these policies function to do is criminalize all the persons who are involved in trafficking, whether it's the trafficked persons themselves, okay? So all women who are in the sex industry somehow become criminals. Women who are domestic workers become criminals, and they're thought of as sex workers. So these are ways in which discourse and policy actually re-victimizes the people that they're supposed to help. And it doesn't do them any good, and it doesn't do the host country any good in any way, right? Because it puts the UAE in a very precarious situation. So this man who's a construction worker, someone like Ravi, who may have been abused, pushed by his boss, is not considered trafficked. These women who are domestic workers going about their daily business are imagined as trafficked. And in fact, what happened as a result of the TIP report was that United States anti-trafficking efforts came in to work with a certain American individual who was running an organization called City of Hope. And what they actually did was they would go on the streets and they would round up women. They would just kind of round them up and put them in cars. And oftentimes these women were abused and raped in the process. But whether or not they were sex workers, whether or not they were trafficked, they were rounded up in these sort of raid and rescue type efforts that came from U.S. policies. So I've talked about how trafficking intersects with gender. I'd like to talk for a moment about race and religion. And I kind of do this, build my analysis off of more recent anthropological literature which has treated race and religion as intricately linked. And there's been much more literature by anthropologists such as Mahmoud Mamdani, but also such as Saba Mahmood, Gayatri Spivak, people who are actually talking about how Islam is perceived of as a racial category in the new rhetoric, right? So Islamophobia as a type of racism, right? Now the TIP report, interestingly, unfortunately furthers this. It's a global scorecard put out by the United States that ranks countries into 3.5 tiers according to perceived trafficking responses and standards. And it bears mentioning that up until last year, the United States had never ranked itself, which really undergirds the strength of a report such as this. Further undergirding this is the opaque nature of the compilation of the report. These tiers are kind of constructed in an almost haphazard way. So you see on tier 1, you have countries like the United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy, Australia, your typical United States allies. Tier 2 are countries that are not quite making the grade, Brazil, Romania, Thailand. The tier 2 watch list, which is unfortunately where the UAE has inhabited quite often in these past years, now it fluctuates. That is sort of seen as these are countries that are not making the grade. They're not on the dreaded tier 3 list, so they're not sanctioned. Tier 3 is subject to sanctions by presidential order. But tier 2 watch list is not the place where you want to be. And it's also not clear why a country like the UAE is put on the tier 2 watch list. But you also have countries like the Philippines, Congo, and Russia. And then tier 3, it's your kind of predictable Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Venezuela, depending on how we feel about them in a given year. And to me, I feel that the disconnect between these rankings is most obvious in the difference between Italy being in tier 1 and Iran in tier 3. Italy is a country known for abuses to migrant workers, known for, if there is any organized crime, there is quite a bit there. And in fact, they don't have much advanced outreach towards trafficked persons. By contrast, Iran, I always ask my students, how many of you have been to Iran? Nobody, right? Because you can't get in or out very easily. So there actually aren't large numbers of migrants in Iran. There are a whole host of other issues, but trafficking isn't necessarily one of them. And so when I would ask members of the TIP office, why is Iran on tier 3? And silence would descend upon the room, and everyone sort of looked at each other, and they would say, I really don't know, but it's just easier to keep them there. Now, you know, I'm not here to defend the Iranian government, which has committed atrocious human rights violations. However, in this particular ranking system, it undergirds the strength of the report when the nature of the compilation is so opaque where no one can actually give you a reason as to why a country is on tier 3, right? So here is where you see race and religion, and of course, United States foreign policy playing a role. Now let's talk for a moment about the discourse on trafficking. The discourse and policies kind of reinforce one another. You have films such as the popular blockbuster hit Taken, or Call and Response, or Human Trafficking, which feature, typically young, white, blonde women who are ripped by these villains who are always Middle Eastern men with thick accents. In Taken, the villains, the masterminds behind the trafficking ring, which Liam Neeson, who is an ex-CIA agent, he kind of blows through Eastern Europe all the way to the Middle East. And of course, this is a spoiler alert, but at the end of the film, the big villains are these Arabs living in the Gulf, and they're on a yacht, and they're selling his daughter, and he goes in and he kills everybody, and there's no consequences. Which is incredibly problematic. I mean, this is the Hollywood discourse. Now, Taken bears mentioning for a particular reason. When this film came out, it was said to be modeled after a U.S. retired Army officer, William Heller. I don't know if people are familiar with him, who was a Green Beret. And he started touring the country after this film came out, talking about how his daughter had been taken and how he had gone to Thailand and he had killed all these traffickers. But at the end, the way his story diverged from the Taken film is that he didn't save his daughter, that his daughter was killed. And so he was co-opted by these anti-trafficking campaigns that were supported by Ashton Kutcher, Real Men Don't Buy Girls, that organization, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook. They had him speaking throughout the country. Last year, I'm not sure if people follow the news or not, last year, retired Colonel Heller was put in jail on 5 counts of fraud. It turned out that not only had he not been a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL, but that he didn't even have a daughter, that he had made up all of this. So it really kind of discredited the sort of taken discourse, right? But this is a discourse that perpetuates itself and that feeds these sort of policies, unfortunately, and certainly it feeds the rhetoric about the issue. And I've already talked about that. So what are some of these misguided policies, and what are the unfortunate sort of cascading series of missteps that befall from these policies? The Trafficking in Persons report specifically recommends for the UAE three things, actually. One is tighten your borders. The second is increase your police. And the third is increase prosecutions of sex traffickers. Now, for a country like the UAE to say tighten your borders, don't let anybody in, I mean, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because there's demand for labor and there's a supply of labor. There are people who want to move to the Middle East, into the UAE, to engage in the booming industry. So tighten your borders, what that results in is people kind of coming in illegally. Increasing your police, there's actually quite a robust police squad. In fact, what the tip doesn't recognize is that there is a human rights force within the police squad in the UAE, and there's a national committee to combat human trafficking also within the police force. So that is sort of all eclipsed by this recommendation. More in line with what the heart of these issues are would perhaps be increased labor inspectors, which is what the UAE was moving towards in 2001 and 2 before they were placed on this list in the tip report, right? So it's really important to note that the UAE was very vested in a migrants' rights approach, which actually is the heart of trafficking. If you kind of work to improve migrants' rights, you are actually combating trafficking in every way. What happened when the UAE was ranked so low in the tip report was that they suddenly had to redirect their attention to the trafficking as defined by the United States tip report. So they had to go after sex traffickers. That's not an easy thing to do, really, when many people can't quite identify their traffickers. So that's kind of the tip recommendations. The tip also mentions that there's no civil society in the UAE, right? That's false. That's civil society maybe as defined by U.S. terms, as in NGOs that have 501c3 tax status. There is a huge presence of civil society. There is a huge migrants' rights movement taking place there. There are a lot of services being provided to migrant workers, and it's completely eclipsed in this report. Other policies are unilateral agreements like the one I've mentioned about the Philippines and Ethiopia, which, again, it was sort of came out of the tip report for the Philippines and for Ethiopia. They made these acts, like the Philippines Household Service Reform Package, without consulting with the host country, right? So it was a unilateral decision as opposed to a multilateral. And, of course, development strategies like City of Hope, which I mentioned, which actually went terribly wrong. So you have these anti-trafficking initiatives that actually are functioning to abuse the people that they're supposed to help. So I want to back up for a moment just to talk briefly about the methodology that I employed to collect the data that I have in this book. The research was conducted between 2004 and 2007. And basically what I did was I would go for 3 months, 4 months a year to the Emirates, and I would interview migrant workers, I would interview activists, I would interview women in the domestic work industry and the sex industry, people from all different backgrounds. So people always ask me, is it just Filipinas? No, it's people from around the world. And I got interested in this project through actually following Iranian women who would migrate from Tehran to Dubai to engage in the sex industry. Not trafficked. They came as high-end call girls and escorts. But that's how I got involved in this project. So I went and I would conduct in-depth interviews, and I followed them. I have followed them since 2004 to see where some of these migrant workers are now. The sample consisted of about 110 people total, which is actually a very large sample for anthropological research. Anthropological research typically caps out at 30 or 40, but I was lucky that I had some good research assistants. And as I mentioned, it's still ongoing. I focused on Dubai and Abu Dhabi, I should say. I wasn't able to do much research in Sharjah or Ras Al Khaimah, though I would have liked to, but it didn't really pan out for me. So the organization of the book, just to kind of give you an idea of where the book goes and what I kind of outline in the book, I sort of start by deconstructing the trafficking issue. What is trafficking? That's why I kind of put in quotation, what is trafficking, right? And why is it that trafficking means something else in Dubai than it does here? Why do we hold the Middle East to a different standard than we do here, right? Why wasn't the U.S. ranked in the tip report? And I deconstruct the term. I deconstruct how it's been boil down to sex work and I look at the abolitionist debate versus the harm reductionists, right, where the harm reductionists are saying, look, this is a reality. People have to migrate to make ends meet. And I should say that, for instance, there's this demonization of women, particularly female migrants. And I should say that most of my sample, most of the women I interviewed in my study, 90% were mothers. And they were engaging in migrant labor, either domestic work or sex work or service work, to feed their children, really. And so criminalizing them, it doesn't really do much because it only makes it harder for them to make ends meet or to provide for their children. The next chapter, I talk about sex work, and so there's this idea that it's rampant in the UAE, which it's not. That kind of goes to this sort of global playground idea that there's millions of sex workers in the UAE. There's actually not. There are people who engage in the sex industry on the side as an income-generating strategy, people who are domestic workers, people who work in nail salons. And that's predominantly done because they are feeling stuck in the industry that they're in, and they're trying to generate more income so that they can go home sooner. Okay. I then start talking about migrant workers. I have a chapter on the migrant workers and the different types of labor that they perform and the problems that they run into. So stories like Ravi's, which I started today's talk with, what are the structural level problems that trafficked persons are up against, right? How is this actually a migrants' rights issue, and how is this a labor issue, right? From there, I kind of talk about the huge presence of civil society in the UAE, and I talk about all the activism that's going on there. I talk about the initiatives, the human rights initiatives that are going on. I talk about groups of Filipinos who are organizing to kind of provide services for other Filipinos. So there's a lot of co-ethnic organizing, and I actually talk a lot about the efforts of the UAE to provide outreach to migrant workers, which has often been eclipsed. From there, I kind of move to a discussion of, I sort of call it building castles in the sand, and I talk about how migrants themselves have tried to assert their agency, and I sort of a weapons of the weak, looking at ways in which migrant workers have carved these sort of labyrinthine pathways to succeed and to build grassroots efforts, and also what they do in the face of challenges. And in fact, if we want to create more robust policies, if we want to create more robust conversations, it would behoove us probably to talk to these migrants and see what they need, right? And also talk to the people in the UAE on the ground who are providing services to them, instead of sort of surmising what's going on, right? And that's kind of what the last two chapters look at. So global women have many reasons for migration, as I mentioned. They're unfortunately painted either as victims of trafficking or of their circumstance. They're very rarely held up as the courageous agents that they really are. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to leave behind your children, go to a faraway country, and try to make ends meet. And I talk a lot about the ways in which the policies in their home countries have actually been operating to their detriment. So many women say, I wish I could stay in the Philippines and get a job. There's no work here for me, right? And so this kind of leads to the structural issues that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, wherein there are countries like the Philippines where sort of IMF, World Bank structural adjustment programs have built into them a dependence on remittances, right? And I think Ray Giardini has put the total numbers of migrant remittances just from the Gulf alone to the Philippines at over $4 billion. That's a lot of money that's being sent home, okay? So remittances are part of the structural adjustment programs. The Philippine economy is dependent on remittances. Women have to migrate to make ends meet. This is a big and integral part of the economy. So you would think that they would think about this main export, but unfortunately, the idea is just sort of how do we maximize remittances, as opposed to how do we make people aware of their rights. And also, there was this idea. I talked to a Filipino woman, and the way she described the Philippine policy, the service reform package, she described it as closing the door but opening the window, where it makes it harder for them to walk out the door legally. They now have to kind of climb out the window illegally and migrate. And of course, when you migrate illegally, you're much more susceptible to rights violations, right? By the brokers, by the middlemen, typically. Men are also conceived of as migrants, never trafficked. So a man who is undergoing abuse, who does try to access the rights as outlined in the trafficking language, is emasculated. is not considered a man. I was at a couple of trafficking conferences here in D.C. when I was a fellow, and I would talk about trafficked men, and everyone would look at me and say, men aren't trafficked. And it was a very defining moment for me where I would say, men aren't. Force, fraud, or coercion. There are a lot of men undergoing that globally. There's limited outreach venues for male workers in general. Men are painted as either better off in the host country or hired for being docile agents, not ever imagined as possibly vulnerable to abuse. And in fact, most of the men I met, they've been sent over by their parents. So kind of who's the trafficker there, really? This requirement that someone have to testify against their trafficker, it doesn't really hold water when there is no real trafficker. Probably the broker would be the person to go after in this instance, but very rarely are we able to go after the brokers. And as I mentioned, this migrants' rights movement, which was really building momentum in the UAE, was eclipsed by the global moral panic about trafficking. So global policies on trafficking are really having the opposite of their intended effect. They're creating a situation where more people are actually abused. They're creating a situation where it's harder to migrate, where it's more difficult to make ends meet. And misdirected energies create obstacles. People like the organization I mentioned, City of Hope, a woman named Sharla Musabe, actually created much more obstacles than helping. She went over there and she had this anti-trafficking initiative to ostensibly help women. She raided, she would go on these sort of sweeps, and oftentimes the women who were in her care were actually abused. So misdirected energies do create obstacles. And really that stems from a need to conceptualize trafficking within a broader context of labor and migration, which is kind of the heart of what I talk about. We have this sort of innocent victim versus guilty migrant rhetoric, and again, a lot of that goes back to Islamophobia, this idea that terrorists, that Middle Eastern men are behind these trafficking rings, versus the structural issues, the realities of inequality, the realities of poverty that actually put people in this sort of paradoxical situation. There's been a recent effort or initiative to end demand. It's not quite clear what people are trying to end demand for, number one, end demand for labor, end demand for intimacy, end demand for love, end demand for sex work. And also, when you end demand, where are these people supposed to go? What industries are these people supposed to work in? I'm sure you've probably heard about initiatives to create John schools, to reform Johns. That, first of all, we know now the data shows that actually that doesn't help. Second of all, ending demand for the sex industry does nothing to stop trafficking, because trafficking is obviously a much larger issue, which is rooted in remittances, structural adjustment programs, poverty, and inequality. So just to kind of wrap it up before I take some of your questions, the book really shows that assigning blame for the social ills of trafficking and sex work to the UAE is neither productive nor accurate, right? Global policies call for state involvement in stopping sex trafficking without recognizing the larger context structuring migration, recognizing where it starts in the home countries, and recognizing where policies, where U.S. policies, where global policies like the United Nations policy even, are actually creating more obstacles than they're taking down. And so I kind of want to leave you with the message that's sort of at the heart of my book, which is that actually the fight against trafficking is actually a fight for migrants' rights. So I'll kind of leave you with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's open the floor to question. Yes, please just wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself. Thank you. You should tell the story of that Iranian woman who goes there to make money and then goes back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can do that.
I'm Ladan Archin. Hi. There's a couple of things. One is that when you're looking at American literature, films, I shamedly have to say I watch Law and Order and other Law and Order things, as well as NCIS. Like, ashamedly, I watch that, unfortunately. But I can tell you, for one, since as an avid watcher of those, that there have been like 3 or 4 episodes on sex trafficking. And the women are mostly in the U.S. They're portrayed as what it is, which is a lot of them are Hispanic women from DR, CR, Mexico, etc. And the traffickers are either drug cartels, and there was one in NCIS where there were actually military men who were bringing in women from Afghanistan. One. So when you look at that when you're looking at films, I think you should take a look at that as well, because it's portrayed very differently. And if there are any dark-skinned men, they're usually Latin Americans. In terms of Dubai, as you know, I've lived there for 2 years. The problem is that when I was there, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of workers' rights that everybody who's there definitely knows that, there is this bifurcation of society, unfortunately, in Dubai. One simple example, a taxi driver from India was dropping off someone in the Palm area. This is what we do know for sure. And he was a gentleman who was Emirati, drives by and just kills the guy. And the thing didn't make it to the...
Sorry, can I have your question?
The question, the point is that these people, that even their migrant rights are, for those of us who've lived in Dubai for years, know that they're not really... I know about City of Hope, and all the ones that you hooked me up to,
really
but that's not...
And that's that.
Migrant workers in the UAE, how do you see that, how you're saying that their rights are, in any way, shape, or form, are being, moved along, whereas, the same other workers who come there, who are not white. And then the other thing is about trafficking in Iran. I agree with you completely why they're there, and it's opaque. But also, they're outside of Tehran. There are a lot from, the villages and stuff who are trafficked into, and some have been, not as well documented as you have, gone to Afghanistan, etc., and other countries in the Gulf, not necessarily from Tehran. So that would be interesting to look at that as well.
Sure. I think with regards to Iran, I guess the point I was trying to make was that I think that trafficking is probably, it occurs everywhere in the world. That there's no question that there's some type of trafficking everywhere in the world. But the slippage of the term really is what disturbs me the most. And I think that, for instance, I know that in Italy there's quite a lot more than there would be in Iran. And I think that was the point I was trying to highlight. I think it would be interesting to look at what's happening sort of intra and from Afghanistan. But there actually are initiatives being set up in Iran to do outreach to trafficked persons and trafficked victims, but putting them on tier 3 completely eclipses that, right? And I think for me, it was really kind of intended to show there's 2 lines in the TIP report where they say, we actually don't have much information on Iran after they've gone on this long tirade about how young girls are forced to marry older men and all this stuff. And I'm not, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but there's this long tirade, and it's all focused on girls and sex and this and that, the other. And then there's just 2 lines at the end where they say, but we don't really have much information on Iran. And it's sort of to go to the sort of opaque nature of that.
Carol, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Carol Murphy, and I'm a journalist, and I just came back from 3 years in Saudi Arabia. I don't know much about Dubai, but the situation of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia is really awful. What makes it awful is that there's no recourse for them. Mm-hmm. There's nowhere to go to get help that's effective. The police are getting a little bit better. But the people that should help them most, their own embassies, are absolutely powerless. They have no negotiating leverage with the Saudi government, and that's partly because they're all poor countries and they depend on these remittances, and they have huge economic unemployment problems at home. I think your book is doing a great service to turn the spotlight more on migrant workers than on the sex trade. My silly question is, what does gridlock refer to?
Thank you. The original title was Traffic Jam, and it's kind of the gridlock is sort of a more heightened traffic jam. It's sort of this gridlock, and the idea was to refer to a traffic jam or a mess of issues that have all been thrown into the pot. And that's the unfortunate thing, is when I talk about trafficking, I feel like I always need half an hour or an hour to talk about trafficking, because first I have to say, okay, well, it's not just the sex industry. It's not, that we have to first pull everything apart, because everything has been mushed in. And when it comes to the Middle East, you also add the sort of Islamophobia into the pot and stir. And so the gridlock was intended to kind of convey that, like, everything is kind of being forced and pushed together in really messy ways, because it's really hard to get out of a gridlock. But thank you for your kind words about my book, and thank you for your comment. I'm very interested in Saudi Arabia also. I'm very interested in hearing more. So.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kate Pfahlenberg. I work on reproductive health and gender. I've worked a little bit on trafficking, more the child marriage side in Asia recently, but we were talking about demand and prosecution, so my question is, for me, the work I've done, the slipperiest part are the brokers. And in your research, what have you found? Like those are the ones with the fraud and the coercion, go to the families and promise jobs and all that. So have you learned anything about how we can center in on that in terms of Department of Labor or migrant rights to make sure these guys are adhering?
Great question. Yes. I think the best way, in fact, you're right. The brokers are oftentimes very problematic because they trick. I mean, I've interviewed brokers, and I say, well, why do you say that to them? And they say, well, I get $2,000 a month, or I get $500 for every person I send over. So they have a very high, incentive to get as many people as possible. And they're usually co-ethnics. So they're people, somebody who's from Hyderabad is kind of working in India or whatnot. The best way to alleviate this is something I've been working with MPI, Migration Policy Institute. The best way to deal with this are bilateral agreements. So agreements between, let's say, the UAE and the Philippines, where they make an agreement that we are going to have X number of workers, et cetera, and that would eliminate the middleman. So bilateral agreements are among the best ways to kind of get around this issue.
Yes, in the back.
That's all right. I don't need a mic.
We need to tape you. You do need a
Okay.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was being taped.
Thank you.
Maybe I should withdraw my questions. I have two questions. The first is, I wanted to ask you, do our embassies in the Gulf, the U.S. embassies in the Gulf or State Department officials, I mean, you noted the problem they interact at the level of police or other state officials. Has there been any change recently? Are there any Foreign Service officers who are actually meeting with or speaking with the migrants or the civil society actors who are dealing with this problem? That's my first question. And the second is just if you've noticed any change, I mean, in the current administration over the last couple of years. I really see as coming out of a few years ago and the administration before the current one. So has there been any change, or is this one of these sort of legacy programs that ends up going on indefinitely, generating reports forever? And those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. I'll answer your second question first, because I think that's a really important question. Yes, TIP is absolutely changing. The new ambassador, Ambassador Seydabaka, who we had here at the Wilson Center last year when we organized the conference, the fact that he's willing to sit at the table with us and listen to us is huge. And he sat there, he came to our conference, and he listened to us. And in fact, his office has started calling upon us, the academics, and saying, what do you think about what we're doing here? And his office really hears our call, the call we've been making the last few years, that it's not just about the sex industry. And so the 2011 TIP report was one of the first reports, was I guess the first that made it so bold, that made migrants' rights so bold. That kind of came before the sex issue, which I think is a huge step forward. And that's huge. That they're to be commended for that. Incremental change. We're still working on other issues, but that's a big change. And then U.S. meeting with civil society. I know the U.S. has an embassy, and they're very active in the UAE. There's still this idea that the UAE doesn't have civil society, which is just not true. And so I feel that that disconnect is still there, where they're not quite looking for the right partners, and they're not quite talking to the right people just yet. But they're probably working on that.
Yes, please.
Bailey Mack. My question is, in one of your earlier slides, you had a bullet point that said strange bedfellows, evangelists, and feminists. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. It's a pretty tricky issue for me here. Yes. Okay. So basically what you have within the trafficking debate is you've got abolitionists or prohibitionists on one side, harm reductionists on the other. The abolitionists, that's the bedfellows I was talking about. So you have evangelicals who, form, for instance, organizations like the IJM, the International Justice Mission, to go out and rescue these rescue missions, save these women, rescue these women. And certain wave feminists, first and second wave, not the newer waves, but certain wave, have gotten on board with that. These are the same, this is sort of, comes out of the pornography wars. These are the same feminists who say that all, pornography, all sex work is violence against women. And so they've gotten on board with this sort of evangelicals to go and start saving women around the world. And that feeds into, there's been a lot of critical literature coming out recently from anthropologists like Laila Abuluqud, Gayatri Spivak, very critical of white women feeling like they need to save brown women from brown men. So,
the gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Andy Guth. I'm from TRAC. I just had a question. I agree, and normally when I discuss this with other people, there are responsibilities both in the source countries, the transient countries, and the destination countries. But I didn't really hear anything about responsibility in the destination country. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. The other question I have is you had mentioned that when the Philippines restricts how many people leave, that closes a door but opens a window. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned that a bilateral agreement that restricts how many people go from the Philippines. Okay.
Not that restricts. That's not. I did not use the word restrict for the bilateral.
Okay, I thought you had mentioned that those two countries agree on how many people will go from the Philippines to
the two countries would agree on facilitating migration, not how many.
Okay. Even on the facilitation, wouldn't that still, if people are unable to facilitate, if only a certain amount are able to go through, wouldn't that still open the door for groups to do kind of a black market human trafficking instead of through the proper channels?
I think it would probably be much less, because if the UAE and the Philippines, for instance, were in conversation, this is the demand, because the UAE knows the demand side better than anyone else, okay? Because the Philippines doesn't know that. The Philippines is just saying, this is how many people we should send over, without necessarily having the agreement, right? So it would actually decrease the numbers of trafficking, because you would have much more of an idea of numbers, right? The numbers would be much more congruent, right? That's one step that could be taken. And so I don't think it would further exacerbate what's going. First of all, it's pretty hard to get much worse than it is in the Philippines, than it is right now. But I think that the bilateral agreements, I'm not arguing for restrictive migratory, right? I'm saying that that it would actually be less restrictive, because it would be in conversation with the host country.
Just two last questions. Yes, there, and then David. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is absolutely a responsibility, but that's already, there is no need for me to, that's already everyone's constantly berating the host country. I'm trying to kind of show an area where the literature is lacking. But there are responsibilities, and in fact, I think the UAE has been very vested in trying to meet those responsibilities, right? So increasing task forces, increasing human rights task forces, trying to work with existing grassroots organizations, because that's something I talk about in the book, which very few people know about, that there are these kind of organizations that are grassroots and that are run by just groups of Indian migrant workers. A great example is an organization called Valley of Love. That is an organization that sprung up in Dubai, a group of Indian migrant workers, and they do outreach to other Indian migrant workers. And you know what? Do you know who's one of their biggest funders? The UAE government. So they actually work very closely. And that's something that not that many people know.
Thank you a lot. Junior scholar from Germany. I have two short questions. The first one, maybe you did mention it. How did you contact the people you have interviewed? As a student, I'm very interested in where to start. Second question is, there is this trans-Arab discourse, like in Lebanon, for example, there's this myth about Saudi Arabian bad guys buying Lebanese young virgins for $1 million, sleeping with them, and then bringing them back home, so they get back home with a lot of money. Did you research in this kind of discourse also? Thank you.
David, let's get David's question.
Going back to Saudi Arabia, and on wondering if there's a parallel to the UAE, this problem of the mistreatment of migrant laborers has gotten so bad recently that both Indonesia and the Philippines can no longer send workers because they complained about the mistreatment of their nationals in Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi said, the hell with you, we'll just close you down. So I'm wondering whether you've had this kind of tensions developing between the UAE and some of the countries that are providing the migrant laborers.
Okay, let me see. I'll try to answer them in order. How method, right? How did I contact? I was fortunate to go through. I worked on, my first book was on Iran. I knew a lot of Iranian sex workers and Iranian migrant workers, and so I followed them. And through them, I met sex workers of all different backgrounds. That's just kind of what happened. And then I started meeting domestic workers. I started meeting all different types of migrant workers. You spend enough time as an ethnographer. It's snowball sampling, the short answer. The trans-Arab discourse, I don't work on Saudi Arabia, and it is a very different case. And so I didn't really research that, but I think that's a great area to look into. I just, like I said, I haven't really worked on that. To go then to the next question about Saudi, what's interesting about Saudi Arabia is that now they recruit from Malaysia, right? And so Indonesia feels that they lost out in a way, right? Because they weren't able to send they can't get remittances anymore, which is interesting. I think, like I said, Saudi's a very different case. And so... I'm asking, is there any kind of tension between governments, UAE and other... So the tension between the UAE government and, say, the Philippines government. Well, the interesting thing is that this new report, the report that MPI put out, so this is a report that, no, it's not. They actually show that there actually hasn't been much communication between the two governments about this particular issue. So without that much communication, it's hard to know how much tension there is. Are they worried that the same thing might happen to them? Is essentially what you're asking. Is are they? I just don't. I don't really know. I work with migrant workers as opposed to government officials. So maybe. I don't know. It's a good question.
Pardis has. I'm sorry. Yeah. We are going to close the meeting, and Pardis has accepted to sign the books. There are books for sale outside. Thank you very much for coming. As always, we learned a lot.
Thank you.
Enjoyed a lot. Thank you.